Absolutely. If you would like to... So, first question is right of reply.
Okay. Simon's argument is the one that was presented to the Joint Standing Committee a lot, that there is something wrong, and Simon used the words let the minor parties do this, let the minor parties do that. I don't like that language. It's a bit like Coles and Woolies saying let the corner stores operate, but there's too many of them, so let's reduce them a little bit. Politics is a marketplace, and it should be treated like a marketplace. It's a contest of ideas. I would say the reason that the minor parties were going against their principles, which I think is what happened in many cases, so some of the results reflected the fact that their preferences went to parties with which they had nothing in common, that the best solution to that is shine the light on it. The Voluntary Euthanasia Party, for example, in Western Australia, should have preferenced the Liberal Democrats very highly. We have a policy on assisted suicide, which is really no different from theirs, and yet they put us way down the bottom. And Clive Palmer, his preferences helped elect Sarah Hanson-Young in South Australia. Greens' preferences helped elect Jackie Lambie in Tasmania. Now, you know, there's no logical reason why those parties should have preferenced each other based on policy grounds. Now, the best solution to the problem of the minor parties not sticking to their principles is exposure, not letting them do this or letting them do that.
Can I?
Yep, no, Bob, if you'd like to as well.
Yeah, I agree with David.
Good man.
Ladies and gentlemen, the system clearly works. Nick, if you'd like to ask a question.
I must say how refreshing and encouraged I was to hear you both outline your broad position on liberty, which is, clearly the most important dividing issue in politics. And if you're on the right side of that argument, then nothing else matters in my view. But just can I ask for clarification really on this question of voting reform? So for clarification, are you both saying that you will you will accommodate no change to the voting system whatsoever, that I'm going to have to wait for 20 minutes outside the voting booth for my wife to finish next time? I mean, is that what I'm going to be faced with, basically?
Well, it depends whether we've gone.
It depends whether you agree with each other.
Look, I think if we're going to have compulsory voting, I don't think you can have it both ways. If they're going to change it above the line, then it's compulsory voting all the boxes above the line or all the boxes below the line. Now, I don't know how long it would take to preference all the parties or preference all the candidates. I mean, I personally support voluntary voting. And if you're voluntary voting, then you can have voluntary whatever you like. But if you're going to compel people to vote, then you can compel them to either vote all the boxes above the line or all the boxes below.
I more or less agree. There is an easy change that could be made, and that is to allow multiple rows of parties on the ballot paper. It doesn't have to be that long. It's only a silly regulation that prevents the AEC from using multiple rows. We have discussed this internally in my party, what would be our plan B if we're backed into a corner and beaten senseless. But I'm not going to discuss what that might be until I'm beaten senseless in a dark room.
Yes, David, my question to you. Generally, I'd agree you wanted to sort of develop service provision to either the profit or the non-profit sector. But I wanted to ask you, particularly as someone in my own case who's had a lot to do with the non-profit sector and has had a lot of doubts over it. First of all, that it doesn't pay tax, but also that it also tends to get a lot of government grants and provide not necessarily particularly good service. How do you deal with the problem of having the services devolved, yet having any guarantee that you get either value for money or good service?
That's directed at me or Bob?
Yes, to you, yeah.
Competition, basically. I think you're referring to the health system. And in that case, if the patient is in charge and the service is poor, the patient will go somewhere else. That's the idea of it. And if the service providers don't include the government, then they're operating either on a profit or non-profit basis, depending on how they're established. But the patients decide which ones they like by voting with their feet. That's essentially the system that I would support.
Seems to work in every other area.
Yes.
Yeah. At the moment we've got a system where in effect it is the political parties who decide where preferences are going to go. Because your alternative, if you don't want that to happen, is to vote below the line. What is being proposed is a system whereby it is the voter, when voting above the line, who will decide where their preferences go. Now, how on earth can both of you defend the first system by saying it is more democratic than the second? I'm afraid I'm at a loss to understand.
Well, the recommendations that they have proposed would essentially put us into a first-past-the-post situation. We have optional preferential voting above the line in New South Wales Legislative Council elections now. We know what happens. Very few people actually indicate a preference. So the end result is it's essentially a first-past-the-post race. Now, that doesn't rule out the minor parties because a quota is only 1/21st of the vote, so you can still get there if you're a small party. But trying to get there with 1/6 of a vote, it's not going to happen. So, and you know, Winston Churchill said democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. You won't get it perfect, but it's a trade-off between reasonable representation and perfection. Then I'd go for reasonable representation, which includes minor parties. You've got two options. You've got a bad option and a worse option. I don't think there are any good options here. If we believe that every vote should remain alive until it reaches a candidate or a party that gets elected, then optional preferential above the line will mean that a substantial number of votes will just die. Now, if we're going to have compulsory voting because we insist that everybody participates and that their vote remains alive, like David said earlier in the lower house, your vote stays alive until it reaches somebody that's going to be elected. If we change it according to the Joint Standing Committee, that will not happen, and they will disappear and their votes will die. So, yeah.
Yes, well, my question actually follows along a bit from that immediately past question. It goes to Bob Day. You seem to be philosophically more aligned with the LDP than with Family First. Family First has got... I mean, I remember what Steve Fielding was like when he was in Parliament, and he seems to have policies which seem to be a fair bit different from the LDP. So I'm just wondering, are you... what's the differences between you and Steve Fielding and the similarities with you and David Leyonhjelm? Does that have an indication of that Family First has moved, or are you somewhat different from what the Family First that Steve Fielding represented?
Family First is obviously a fairly new party. It's been going for around about 10 years. I think the Israelis have a very old saying, "Pervi blen chomon," which means the first pancake is always lumpy. Whenever you start anything for the first time, you get a few lumps in the first pancakes. Now, you know, I'm not here to criticise Steve Fielding, but the party's essential philosophy hasn't changed. We believe that family is at the centre of society, the foundational stone. Every family, a job, a house, finances under control, secure retirement, family values, those sorts of things. Now, the objectives are the same. The implementation, I know it's, was it Albert Camus said, you know, men are not convinced by your sincerity or your objectives, only by your death. You know, politics is a do or die, you know, you live or die by it. So, look, the essential policies are pretty much the same since the party started. I guess I just have a different way of communicating them, promoting them, emphasising them than what Steve Fielding did. Steve was very good on climate change and introducing the scepticism on that. Some of the other things, well, we disagreed with, but look, here we are now, and seems to be going okay so far. Does that answer the question there?
Yep. Stephen, and then there, and then there.
Thanks very much. Every one of the speakers, including Cassandra and Simon, used the word democracy and democratic, and recently in the answer to the last question, representation. But it's hard to imagine a less democratic body than the Australian Senate as a governing body. It certainly is not representative. And its entire existence was really a compromise at the time of Federation to protect the colonies.
I'm going to get John Stone to answer this question.
A state's house that would protect the small colonies, but it's evolved into something completely different, hasn't it? The Greens, for example, have no interest in protecting the states. They spend most of their time taking things away from the states and centralising them. So what's the point of having an unrepresentative, undemocratic body in a modern democratic society?
Well, the answer is we do have a Senate, and we do have senators, and we do have hegemony of the big states over the smaller states, and that needs to be addressed because, for the simple reason is, federalism works. It's a better system. And the dichotomy between the lower house representation and the states is a better system. Now, my first observation was that why aren't all the senators sitting with their state colleagues instead of with their party colleagues? Of course, the clerk said, I'm going to have trouble with you, aren't we? But it still is. That's in our constitution. The fact that they've departed from it, Stephen, is not the issue.
Can I add just very quickly? The origins of the Senate, origins of Australia's two-house system, if you like, also has roots in the UK system, with the House of Lords being a house of...
The American system, actually.
American,
and a house of review, an upper house being a house of review. I see that as how it's evolved instead of the state's house system. And if you just had a unicameral system, a House of Representatives alone, you have what some people call dictatorship of the majority and no review. And I think it's good for democracy to have a House review. So therefore...
The Senate to just review, like the House of Lords.
So, well, I can't change the rules, so the Senate is what it is, but I think it is healthy for democracy, which is the point of the initial point of your question, is to have a House of Review in a democracy. I think that is healthy for it, and therefore it also makes sense to have alternative views, not just the majoritarian view, in that House of Review.
State-based review.
One there,
Well,
one there.
he thinks that's more important than I do, but there you go, there's a difference.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Could I ask each of you gentlemen, my perception is that your two main issues are lower taxes and smaller government.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good guess.
Yes.
Okay. Now, can I ask you, do you have either theoretical or iconic models for each which you have as a framework, or do you keep saying lower taxes and smaller government at every position? Have I made myself clear on that one? Or?
Not really.
No.
Taxes can't be low enough, and there can't be not...
of tax which is your desired level, or a proportion of government which is small government, and or do you have economies or governments which represent your desired state that we could relate to?
Well,
State, not state as in Commonwealth.
Every nation's different, but I suspect that a 20% single rate tax would be the optimum revenue raising and avoid... I spoke to a Tax Institute conference a couple of weeks ago with hundreds of very, very highly paid tax lawyers whose primary aim was tax minimisation and tax sort of planning and all the rest of it. It's a phenomenal amount of money that if that was not necessary or was not value for money, then the coffers would overflow with tax revenue, as has been demonstrated in many places around the world. So if you're looking for a figure, I would say around about the 20% single rate with a 20,000, say, tax-free threshold, and obviously an alignment, the company tax and personal tax to be the same.
Thank you. And government, where would that sit? What is a small government?
Would smaller the better suffice? David, how small a government do you... Greg, how small a government?
You start by cutting,
Yeah.
and when you cut, then you cut a bit more. And don't stop. In fact, you can look at... If I want to get philosophical for a second, and I don't really want to for tonight, but John Locke said there's only three things governments should do. Protect life, liberty and private property, nothing else. And once we got to a government that only did those three things, then I'd say we probably got there.
One there, and then last one here, and then I've got a couple of questions.
My first question is more a follow-up question from the previous two, which I don't think were answered fully. So I can understand, I know you're sort of going on with a unity ticket at the moment with your joint voting bloc and everything, but I can understand where David's coming from in his suite of policies. But Bob, are you really saying that you, as a Family First candidate, support David on issues such as gay marriage, euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia, gun rights? So that's my first question. Surely I would expect there to be a point of difference between the two of you on those issues. And secondly, I was also wondering if you've considered how, I understand you'd be leaning against the government so that it does the right thing more than it does a popular thing on things such as the deficit levy, which I'm sure most of us have similar views on, the deficit levy on direct action, paid parental leave and the like. But how do you propose to balance that with the need to keep the government from breaking its promises and therefore keeping it accountable for the bad promises it made, and not leading it to electoral problems and ultimate defeat, which could lead to a worse outcome in the end? Do you have any approach as to how you balance those two?
Well, we're only two brand newbies, we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves or a little bit too big for our boots, but look, we'll see how we go. We'll do our best. I can't see that some of the social issues that I suspect that we differ on will come up too frequently in the next Parliament. Where the real game is in the things that we've been talking about tonight. And I think that's what we'll focus on. If the other things come up, well, who was the American politician said, I have friends who are duck hunters and I've got friends who are anti-duck hunting and I always stick by my friends, sort of. Family First has two MPs in the South Australian Parliament, and even those two voted differently once on rodeos. I think one was supportive of rodeos and one wasn't. But hey, it didn't cause a split in the party, and I can't imagine that we'd have too many different. But David, I don't know.
No, there are obviously differences between Bob's party and the Liberal Democrats on social issues, but I look at politics as a kind of a Venn diagram analysis, and we have large areas of overlap. That's what I celebrate. The areas we don't overlap, I'm not going to die in a ditch over those mostly. I'd rather work with Bob on the areas we do agree on. I'll do my own thing on the things where I think Bob is not with me. I won't embarrass him by expecting him to support me, and I dare say he might have the same view on some of the things that matter to him.
I will die in a ditch over something.
Yeah, but I think they'll be the same ones.
Okay, right.
Okay, one more.
Gentlemen, my question is concerning your stated position of lower taxes. I don't know if you saw last Tuesday's 7:30 report with Jackie Lambie from the Palmer United Party, whose philosophy is basically tax the crap out of the banks, and no doubt there will be other industry sectors that are going to cop it as well. So how do you see in the Senate you're going to get along with her, intellectually speaking? And by the way, I'm not a banker.
Look, I've met and spoken to Jackie a number of times, and she's on a steep learning curve, the same as the rest of us. And I think these are areas where we'll discuss them and what the practicalities of and implications of some of these ideas. I mean, she's new, we're new, we'll throw in ideas. I've suggested that we have like a a mini secretariat where we have we're all briefed at the same time, rather than the government sort of sticking 6 lots of legislation on our desks and saying, okay, process this by Monday. If we all met together, were briefed together, and we could throw ideas around, I think that's the way we learn about what works and what doesn't work, and I think Jackie's no different in that area.
Can I just add a little? I agree with Bob as usual, but I can just add one little bit in that I would be very surprised if Jackie stays in Clive's tent for all that long, and the media, I think, and until recently, probably the government has got it wrong, and that they've been talking to Clive and thinking that he is talking on behalf of the Palmer United Party senators and Ricky Muir. Bob and I have met them. Well, I haven't met Dio Wang, but I've met the others. And I don't think they will stay in Clive's tent for all that long. They don't have any compelling reasons to do so. There's no philosophical bond between them. Bob and I agree on so many things without even talking about it because we come from the same philosophical position. They don't have that in common. I am not expecting them to agree on lots of things. I think it will be difficult for them to reach a party consensus many, many times. There are suspicions that Clive will find that very frustrating and will suffer relevance deprivation syndrome. And the speculation is that he will elbow one of the senators out of the way and come and join the party, in which case it will get really very interesting.
Okay, just to wrap this up, I want to ask a couple of very short questions about your policy positions on a few different things. So, position on abolition of the carbon tax.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Mining tax.
Yeah.
Abolition of 18C.
Yes, yeah.
How about the changes of family tax benefits?
Well, it's timid, but yes.
Yeah, with a qualification. I mean, taking money with one hand, giving it back as a tax family benefit. I mean, why are we giving families on 100,000? Why don't they get a tax deduction? This is, again, it's a tax problem, not a welfare benefit problem.
I agree with Bob.
Yeah.
Medicare co-payments.
Yeah, that might be a difference. I agree with that. Yes.
You know, if it's free, I'll take 2. You know, if it was $1, no one would worry. $7 may be a bridge too far for some people. A compromise at maybe $4 or $5 might get them over the line.
The changes to youth unemployment benefits.
Not without removing some of the barriers and obstacles of getting a job first.
You're referring to the minimum wage when you make that comment?
A person should have the right to work for anything, either work for nothing or work for whatever they like. I'm not interested in minimum wages or anything, only in a person's decision that they make themselves on what figure they place on it.
Yeah, I agree with what Bob just said. I'm not sure about that proposal. I haven't looked at the detail in any great attention so far.
Fuel indexation, fuel excise indexation.
No.
It's a tax increase, no.
And presumably same thing for negative gearing?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there a proposal?
No, I'm just interested.
Oh, right.
Trick question.
Wash your mouth out.
In the last 30 seconds that we have left, would you like to just sum up what you're hoping to get out of the next 6 years?
You go first.
I wanted to, look, it's no secret my hero is Bert Kelly, as I said in my preview talk. If I can remove the other side of the coin and do half as much as Bert Kelly did, or at least raise the absurdity of labour regulation, then I will think I will have achieved something.
Leaving aside his foreign policy views, my hero, or my example, I suppose, would be Ron Paul. What I would like to do is start a libertarian fire, if you like, and have it spread in the way that it's spread in America, with Ron Paul as the kind of mentor to it. And it's spread to the Republican Party. It set off the Tea Party, which has morphed into other things, which aren't always good, but he set off an entire libertarian movement in America. The problem is that he took 20-odd years to do it, and I don't have that long, so I'm going to have to get on my skates. But that's the sort of model I have in mind.
Fantastic. We'll just invite Greg to sum up, and thank you very much from my perspective for your attention tonight, and I'll pass it back to Greg.
I think we're in for a bit of a roller coaster ride, clearly from the 1st of July. Bob mentioned his hero was Bert Kelly. Bert, of course, was a hero in this place as well. And whenever his name comes up, you think of the grand things he was able to do as an MP, and a man with other ways of doing things, like David. Bert, of course, wrote agricultural columns, sort of, in the Financial Review as the modest, initially the modest member, and then ultimately the modest farmer when he left Parliament. Another hero of this place is, in fact, standing on the wall right behind you, namely Hayek. Now, of course, Hayek wrestled for most of his life, once he sort of left a lot of the early economics aside, as to what to do about democracy. He talked about upper houses. In fact, he gave a talk here in 1976 in Australia, in Melbourne, I think, called With a Democracy, where he put forward a number of different sort of ways you might look at having the upper houses. He was in favour of an upper house work to make democracy more effective and not get captured by various groups and this, that and the other. So you're in a fine place to be talking about this sort of thing, David and Bob. So on behalf of us all, I'd like to thank you very much, and also Bob particularly for coming up from Adelaide. But he knows who we are because he used to come to board meetings here. So thanks again to both of you. Thanks to Cass and to Simon for your participation, and thanks everyone for coming along tonight and also participating in the discussion. So would you please thank our speakers.